And then there is another approach where people try to connect their relation with the sense world, the world of science, with their anthroposophic path. Are there possibilities to get an insight or experiences shifting the attention to phenomena in one's own consciousness in connection with the sense world, and trying to develop, so to speak, anthroposophical experiences with the sense world, with the realm of natural science. One example for me is a person like Johannes, who some of you might know, and his work. And Wachsmuth, in many cases, used a very different approach from all of these, and therefore is in our time not very much appreciated. There are very few people who know his work. And so I think that the intentions one can find in his work are extremely valuable, though reading his books, at least for a person like me, is extremely challenging, not because of its intellectuality, but because of the way he draws conclusions and so on. So his work on the atmosphere has obviously, though he only mentioned it on the side, on the, how you call it, half sentence, is obviously inspired by a few remarks Rudolf Steiner made, and that should taken into our consciousness tonight, because there are a few doctors amongst us, and in a few months there is the 100-year celebration, another one, for the first lecture Steiner gave for the Council of Doctors at our home in the glass house at the Goetheanum. And in one of these lectures, Steiner mentioned, so to speak, that the Earth is surrounded by layers. And I will show you Steiner's drawing. That is this. It's not Steiner's drawing, but Asya Turgenev made the drawing after his painting on the blackboard. And that is in this first course for the doctors, March 31 in 2001, in 1920. I think it's the 11th or the 13th lecture. And then you see, he said, we have the earth, fluid, air, warmth, light, chemical, and life. So it's the whole spectrum of nature around the earth. And this drawing, I think, inspired Wachsmuth. And Wachsmuth, of course, at the end of his life, he published this book in Earth and Man. Is it the English title? And in a way, I heard that his earlier books, the two books he published in the 20s, he himself didn't want to be published again. So he knew. So, and most of the content we find in his later books. And concerning the atmosphere, it is this Earth and Man. And in this book we find different things. For example, what I mentioned in the morning, this daily period of temperature, this rhythm thing. But concerning the atmosphere, we find this drawing. So we had to rely, of course, on the scientific results of his time before. And when we compare that with actual research, it is not that wrong. It is quite close. And this is the lower part of the atmosphere in the drawing of Günther Wachsmuth. There is a 4th edition in German. I used the 3rd. So there are 7 that came out in the 50s and early 60s. And I think the 4th came later. And then you see the lowest part is what is called the troposphere. That's where all the weather takes place and where we live, so to speak. Of course, one can look for the lowest meter and a half, which is a little bit different again, and so. But that is the first layer, and we know that the weather takes place there, the clouds are formed, and just to give you an impression, and I thought it was nice if you see something, I show you some clouds that is from northern Germany, close to where I grew up, and cumulus clouds. And another example, and there we see it has to do something with weather. When we see something like that, it's better to find one's way home. That's the lower part. And when we look back at the picture, he points out that at the highest part of the troposphere, there we have the cirrus clouds. This fine feather-like clouds, and of course, again, I put some picture in that. This is a region where sometimes the planes are moving. Therefore, we have these contrails here, and if the weather is or the atmosphere is there in an unstable situation, a lot of these contrails appear and can stay for a while, and that is, then they have a pattern. For example, close to Dornach, the airport of Zurich, sometimes they have to wait and then they fly oval paths, and when they go several times like that, there is a pattern of the contrails, and then people think, yeah, these are chemtrails. But knowing Switzerland, they would never allow a foreign force to do something like that in their country. So that is probably not that true. But the next is special because there we have a certain light appearance. Halos appear in this form of clouds because they have ice crystals in them. And sometimes I heard in our country, no, in the country where I am now, in your country, sometimes people speak of a fire rainbow. You've heard that? That is when this can go quite brilliant around the zenith. It's an halo appearance. It's not a rainbow, it's not raining. And in this picture, here is said perlmutter,
Mother of pearl.
mother of pearl, thank you, clouds. And what we saw in this picture is close to that. Not exactly, but close. So there we come into this layer which is called the stratosphere. Here you see the temperature. And the temperature is going down here when we climb up the mountains. And when we are in the stratosphere, it is around -50, -60 centigrade. When you have an international flight, you are in that region. And the temperature is like that, and then the air is very dry. And when they suck in the air, and it gets warm, because we don't want to sit in the plane with -60 degrees, the air gets very dry. Therefore, it's good to drink a lot of water during longer flights. And this is what we call the stratosphere. And in the center here, we have, it's not on this drawing, but Wachsmuth mentioned that too already. We have this layer of a higher concentration of ozone. And there is lots of cosmic radiation, ultraviolet radiation absorbed. And therefore, when we had this ozone hole, people are asked to put some screen on their skin or even wear something it's protecting, because that was, for example, in Australia and the southern hemisphere, quite dangerous. And it is an example where international effort came to a result, because the ozone hole is getting smaller now. So, and by this absorption, when the gas absorbs this ultraviolet radiation, it gets warm, and therefore the temperature is increasing again. You see it goes here. And then one can see sometimes meteors. And of course it's possible by triangulation to measure the height. Where are they appearing? Can you imagine? Just from 2 points and that. And this is then around 50 kilometers in the center. Sometimes this whole region is called the stratosphere. And there is the highest concentration of ozone. And there the meteors appear. And instead of showing a picture, I have 2 little pieces of meteoric iron, because it's not only iron, and I can pass them around if I get them back. They are very precious to me. And this is the natural form, how you can find them if you are very lucky. And this is a plate which is done by sawing, cutting. And then the surface is polished and etched, yes, with some acid, and then you get the Wiedmann-Stetch figures. Wittmann-Stetsch was an Austrian scientist, and he discovered that. And they can be seen here. I don't know whether you can see them from there. I give them and pass them around. So starting here, it's nice to have something like that. I should tell you, I got as a gift once a piece of meteoric iron. I gave a lecture, and the lecture at the conference were assembled in the end, and the woman who organized that said, I got money from the government for this conference, and so everybody of you gets 500 euros, except you. She pointed on me. Come with me. She took me to another room and said, then you can choose with this brown package or 500 euros. And I opened the package, and there was such a piece of meteoric iron, 5 kilos. 5 kilos, yes. Good choice. Of course, yeah. I love that. It's beautiful. So that is here. And then at the end of this, he said around 75 today. There you see the difference. One said 80 kilometers. There's another boundary, so to speak, and there we have certain clouds which can be seen sometimes when one is lucky, and they are called lenticular clouds. And of course, no, these are not northern lights. These are clouds astonishingly high, because when you look at this, you think there's really no gas left, let alone drops. But in a way it is possible. I'm not sure, I don't know what we really see there, but they are that high. And so they appear after I saw them once after sunset. This is a nice picture, and because they are so beautiful, I have some more. You see, it's nearly night, and then there are bright clouds. Therefore, they need to be high. They must be high. Are these? Yes, and going back to that, above that, always higher than 75, 85 kilometers are the northern lights, or the polar lights. And they can be seen at both poles. But they go up much higher. They can go up to 1,000 kilometers. So that is quite far away. And a few months ago, there was an article that one can find even traces of the earthly atmosphere on the moon, which is about 300 to 400,000 kilometers away. So it is difficult to say the atmosphere is ending there or there or there. And I think when Julie showed us this picture of the very thin layer, it was only that, where we see mostly the blue sky and that. But the blue sky is even higher too. So, and of course, going on with the phenomena of that, the view we have, that is an example of northern light. And if you ever have the possibility to see that, it is very surprising. These are stars. And then if the light appears like a cloud. And if there were a cloud, you couldn't see stars through it. and it is so thin that you can see the stars through the light. And another picture, and again, this you probably know. This, the Great Bear, and then there's the Northern Pole. And it took people quite a time to figure out how they come about. Now I have to look. Yes, let's have a look on how you find it today when you look for the atmosphere on Wikipedia or something in book. Then you see again the troposphere. Here they say up to 15 kilometers. That is unusual. The stratosphere, mesosphere, to 80 kilometers, and that was where the drawing of Wachswood ended here. And then they speak of thermosphere because it's warmer, and then above 500 kilometers, that's exosphere. Interestingly is, when you look at the thermosphere, and people speak that it is warm there. If you would go there and put your hand out, you wouldn't feel the warmth. Because the air is so thin that there is no, as a physicist I would say, thermal capacity. It can't warm your hand or whatever. It is just like vacuum insulating. So the temperature is, as far as I know, calculated out of other effects. Okay, here is again a modern picture. It's unfortunately too small to read. I couldn't increase it. And there again, you have the troposphere here, Mount Everest, clouds, ordinary airplanes, and then you have the stratosphere, balloons, research balloons, international flights, and yes, that is experimental airplane. And there is where it's warm, there is this ozone layer. And they drew the ozone hole, and in here we have 50 kilometers, now 85 kilometers, and then only rockets can reach that. So our phenomenological approach is quite reduced. And so space shuttle in that Sputnik and other spacecrafts in this round, and you see here the temperature is quite high here, goes down, and then comes up again, and therefore it's called thermosphere, though it is very thin air there. They write here something about 1,200 degrees Celsius. I don't know how, unfortunately, how that is measured. And here you see these names: troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, this transition, thermosphere, and exosphere. And what is interesting is, in addition to one is back. In addition to what we looked at, here is another curve I didn't say anything about. It's what they call electron concentration. So free electrons, and that means free other chemicals as well, charged particles. So a sphere with lots of possibility for chemical reactions. So like for example, if you do electrolysis and get hydrogen, then one says the hydrogen right at the electrode is in status 10. Do you say that in English as well?
Yes.
And that means it's very high reactive until it forms, it condensates, so to speak, and forms H2. And in that way, we have elements in status 10 in that region as well. And going back to Wachstum's approach, he gave a table which you can't read. But it's interesting, at his time, 40 kilometers was the highest altitude which was reached. And then he looks, what is with the light? What is with the warmth? What is with electricity? What is with radiation? What is with chemistry, with wind? And yes, that is important for us. And that way, he tried to find what is typical for the different layers and connected to Steiner's Roy. And here he relates that to the etheric, and in the middle of the stratosphere we have this ozone layer where it gets warm. We saw that. So he calls that like a warm coat around the Earth. And then above, there is this layer of very thin air where nearly nothing is known to happen. And there's no absorption of light and no scattering of light. And so light can pass, as Wachstum described it, free. So he says, and even one can see there in this altitude components of light which is coming from the Earth. I tried to figure out what he meant by that, and I was not sure whether there is a light source in something. The Earth acts like a light source. I've never heard something like that at other places, but there might be a possibility. And so he said, above that, we have a zone of the light ether, because light is just there without being absorbed or scattered or whatever. And then we have this sphere in the earlier picture I said, where we have all these free electrons and radicals. He calls it the sphere of the chemical ether. And let me see. And then we have this sphere where we have only cosmic radiation, and for some unclear reason, in a very general formulation, he said that is the sphere of the life ether. And his approach there is that there must be something which, so to speak, holds things together to concentrate that the organism of the earth can exist. So that is his approach, very vague in my opinion, approach to the life ether. So in a way, one can say he tried to read in nature, in the book of nature. And though it is with very few phenomena which are there, and then he took his own artistic approach and tried to make their colored drawings. The blue is the chemical, that was in a way magenta, of course, because of life, and then white, the light ether, and the warmth is green here, and then it goes down to stratosphere, that lower stratosphere, troposphere, and earth. And in a way, we have the earth, we have the water, we have the air in the troposphere, and then go up. So that is, in a way, Wachsmuth's approach, Wachsmuth's attempt to make something out of Steiner's drawing. And it is, to me, quite interesting that nobody else since then tried to approach the atmosphere in a Goetheanistic or whatever way. At least there are no publications as far as I know, and I should know. And I once tried to engage a younger meteorologist to look at Wachsmuth and try to do something similar with modern scientific results, but then he drifted off. So until now, we didn't find someone to do that. Okay, now, I can switch that off. Then it's quiet. Now one can ask, what sort of an approach is that? For example, when we think of warmth, we just look for higher temperatures. But the field of warmth, and when we look at Steiner's warmth course, is much, much broader than temperature. And it has very much to do, when we look at Steiner's work on warmth, with this something appears and something else disappears. For example, when you boil water, one of Steiner's examples, you have heat, but the temperature is not increasing, but a vapor comes up. So the warmth disappears without increase of temperature, and something changed and something new appears. So it is a question to me, is it fruitful or is it appropriate, is maybe a better word, to approach that just looking for the temperature? It's maybe a first step, but then one can ask, can we go deeper into that? And that, of course, raises the question, how at all can we approach the etheric? And that connects, has a connection to what I said in the morning with this question, what is subnature, what is supernature? Because subnature has this, it is excluded from the context. Steiner wrote in this letter, this last letters to the members, he wrote, subnature is technology which is isolated from the cosmos. And of course, when we hear cosmos, we think of Jupiter, the sun, moon, the zodiac, and so on. But when we look at the original meaning of that word, we see cosmos is harmony, context. So harmonical context, it needs not to be what's up there. And so the technology is separated from the context, and the supernature, when we look then at supernature, can mean, in the first step, to be aware of the context. I once wanted to call our institute for Contextual Science, because that's exactly what we try to do in this realm of anthroposophical orientated science. But my colleagues thought we need a German word, and there is no good German expression for that. So we skipped, we had that in our on our letters sometimes, but yes, there's no good expression. Contextual science is good. And you might know this first book of Craig Holdridge had the subtitle, The Forgotten Factor of Context. And yes, the German translation, yes, had not such a nice title. And so one can look, how is that in connection, this approach, an approach to the etheric, which includes what we know from Steiner, in addition to that drawing, about possible approaches. And the first thing I think is a very deep orientation about that are these lectures about evolution from the perspective of truth. That was a free translation by yours sincerely. I don't know what, I think the English title is similar. You know that. Same. Evolution from the perspective of truth.
The inner realities of
inner reality. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. And these are amazing lectures where Steiner started to say, in the book of occult science, I wrote about the evolution for the public, Now I will tell you how it really is. Interesting with Steiner to find something like that. Well, there were lectures for the members, of course. And when we look how he describes warmth, then he said, where warmth is, there is always the gesture of sacrifice, the gesture of the courage to sacrifice oneself. So, can we find in our souls what does it mean to sacrifice at least a little bit of ourselves so that something else can appear? And two gestures I came up with is, for example, if we pay attention to something intentionally, that is something which doesn't happen by itself, but we need a certain energy, and I want to listen to it. Not because your story is breathtaking, but I want to listen to you. And then the other person can tell something which in another case might be impossible. And the second thing, take up responsibility. When we take up responsibility, it is something where we sacrifice a piece of ourselves that something else can appear. Think of a child, for example. And in many cases, of course, that happens by itself, because otherwise children couldn't be raised. But when you see what the mother is doing or the parents are doing for children, that is this gesture, taking over responsibility, looking what is necessary, not because of me, but because for the reason that something else can appear. And then we can look what is it with light? The next step. What is it with light? And when we approach light in a phenomenological way, and we touched that in the afternoon a little bit, but in my view, maybe not radical enough, then when we touch that, we see that we don't have a perception of light in that way. We see the bright lamp, and we see the brightness on the screen or the walls or whatever. But when we speak of light, we mean that in between. That there is a connection. But this connection is not in the perceptual world. And where else can it be? In our thinking. It's in most cases half-conscious thinking that then came our what do you call that? Images, inner images, mental pictures, and we think something is flying from there to there. And the better we know about physics, the more we know that there is nothing flying. And so flying photons are done. That's wrong, even in physics. And when we try to look at the theories, for example, of electromagnetic waves, it's a mathematical concept to describe the connection. And so the essence of light is a context, an actual context, just there. Of course, we spoke about that in the afternoon, that we connect velocity with light, and of course, I know how it's measured, and I made this experiment myself once, so it's clear. But when you do this experiment yourself, you see it is, again, a context of pictures where with a huge effort, you try to put some time in by rotating mirror or the cavitation or whatever. And so this velocity of the connection is more or less in the background. And the context is in the foreground. And this is a context that one bright object makes it possible that others appear. We have the lamp, and I can see you. We don't see the light, but we see each other. That's an interesting gesture. Light is not appearing, but letting appear. And when Steiner spoke about light and air in these lectures I mentioned, then he always coins an expression, and there he said, can you say gifting?
We say bestowing.
Bestowing virtue. Bestowing virtue. In German, schenkende Tugend. For air and light. Because it's a sort of virtue to step back from appearance and let other things appear. And we see in both cases, in the case of warmth and case of light, it has a moral quality. We can't approach the etheric without including a moral quality. And then we can ask for the next step, the chemical ether, or how it's called by Steiner, chemical ether, sound ether, and number ether, Zahlenäther in German. So obviously integers. And when you look at chemistry, for example, or at music, you see we have always two qualities. One is a metamorphosis in time. Music without time would work. Chemistry without time. Inorganic chemistry is quite fast. Organic chemistry needs time. Or, yes, carbon chemistry needs time. But then, in the end, we have a sort of state. We can have like a melody and an accord. Like Beethoven violin concert. So you see there is melody and then an accord. And the whole melody already is, in a way, the accord. And in chemistry, you have the reaction, the process, and in the end, the product, the compound. And again, like in the accord, we have relations which can be described with small integers. It's surprising. And so I think these two approaches, in Bockemel's description, we have mostly a view on the metamorphosis, not on this accord or the product. But we have these two, I think, connected with chemistry. And in Steiner's description in these lectures, we find that again. He mainly connects that with water, and he calls that creative resignation. Isn't that interesting? Creative resignation. Let go. Producing and let go. And that's these two components of movement and rest. And in the case of water, it's easy to describe that on one hand, the water forms the landscape, and later the river follows the landscape. Both is present. And I think things like that, where we have a sort of contradiction, are very important, because in many cases we try to think, maybe that is inspired by the right or wrong in science, we tried to think a certain judgment is either wrong or right. And one of my favorites in physics is Niels Bohr. And Niels Bohr once said, when we have a small truth, whatever that is, a small truth, then the opposite is wrong. When we have a great truth, the opposite is true as well. That's Niels Bohr. Of course, you see all the complementarity philosophy in that, but it is very interesting to test that approach, that in many cases, life is not either that or that, but it lives in these contradictions, and that is something we have in this chemical forming, process, and rest. And then the last, the life ether, that is interesting how it is possible to describe that, and I think it is not by chance that even in Wachsmuth's description it stays vague, because then one has to see what makes an organism. There were times when people thought, scientists thought, there is another force acting like a physical force. And therefore, some laws of chemistry may be not valid in an organism. And even in anthroposophy, one finds that sometimes Steiner speaks about the etheric, like, yes, he compares this with magnetism, like a force going in there. And I think that is inappropriate for the etheric, because it is all about context. And what we see when we look at an organism is that there are all these chemical processes and physical processes and so on, and they all go on according to their physical and chemical laws. If acid and alkaline come together, they form salt. But if there's a membrane, they can be kept apart. And so I think the crucial gesture of an organism is that all these different processes of the lower etheric, so you understand, I don't like the term etheric forces because it implies a force like this. But the lower etheric contexts, they are all taken up for a certain higher organism. So every single part works to maintain itself in the context of the whole. If you take away an organ, the whole is in danger, but sometimes, in many cases, a different organ, another organ, can take over the task. That is sometimes possible in life. So it is like lots of activity in a context of a center. That is, so to speak, as good as I could describe what I have in mind with this life ether. And when we look with this concept at the atmosphere, that's our original question, then as far as I can tell today, maybe we get better with that, I can't find that in the order of the height, of the altitude, because there might be regions where this sacrifice is mainly present, and there might be other reasons where this possibility of appearance, where this possibility of appearance is present, and there might be regions where this transformation and rest is present, but even the latter is present in the troposphere. There is a lot of transformation. So I couldn't find it yet in the altitude layers, though these layers are certainly of great importance, and they are like skin. Wachsmuth at a certain point compares the skin with these layers. They are like a skin, but when you look at what I said about life ether, the whole atmosphere is organized so that the earth can be there with human beings. The earth could be there with different beings, maybe, or without beings, but that it can be there with human beings. We have this very fine structure and organization of the atmosphere. And for now, it is difficult for me to say, up to that altitude, we have warmth, and then we have light, and then we have chemistry, and then we have life, because it is one in the other. Maybe one can go further with that at a certain point. And I would just like to finish that in the way, and I think that how I describe this, I try to describe these steps of the etheric when you look for the quality in your own soul and try and connect that with this morality. There is something like this supernature, how Steiner called that, Übernatur, in this last letter. And this whole so sensitive layers around the Earth are in this situation of danger. And I said this morning, and I like to repeat that we speak about 1.5 degrees. And normally, whether it's 22 degrees or 23.5, wouldn't matter for us. But at a certain situation, it matters a lot when we have fever. Then 37 or 38.5 is a huge difference. And for the Earth as an organism, it's obviously the same. 2 degrees make a huge difference. And so one can see that with this warming, something maybe is active in connection with the Earth, which is comparable to a human being having fever, and that means in the anthroposophical medicine an activity of the human eye, or the organization of the human eye. The immune system is active, then we get fever. And then we can ask ourselves, does this crisis about these few degrees has to do something with the being of the Earth? Not only the organism, but something with the activity of the spiritual being of the Earth. And in this crisis, asking something from mankind and how it is connected, humanity, mankind, with this being of the Earth. And we know that in the Rosicrucian tradition, there we can find something about what is the true being of the Earth and why the sun had to take over the solar system and so on. So that might have to do with the spiritual being of mankind at all. And I think it is a question worth not to answer, but to keep in mind when one looks at this crisis. Thank you for your attention.
Will you take some questions?
If people
I will read you 2 questions that came in. We did get the webinar. And the first question is, how has the mystery of Golgotha affected the Earth's atmosphere?
a second. The second question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying just a second.
Yes, therefore I asked for the second.
The second question has to do with Carl Koenig, and the question is, didn't he relate the layers of the atmosphere to the layers of the human embryo?
That is possible. One of the doctors know that. There is a publication of Carl Koenig about the human embryo, I know, but that was only study material. I didn't read that. Maybe it's a good hint to look at that. And the other question is, of course, in that way difficult. For all I know, there is not something where we can say that changed physically in the atmosphere in around 2000 years ago. There is nothing I know about. And I know, for example, people, there are two quotes of Steiner where he said that radioactivity, no, he didn't say that in that words, but people make out of that radioactivity only appears since the mystery of Golgotha, after the mystery of Golgotha. But there are only two places where that comes from, and one is another person describing a lecture he gave, and the other place is again another person describing a conversation they had, and there might be misunderstandings because out of scientific approach we have no indication that the opposite, that this is radioactivity in what we understand with that appears only after the mystery of Golgotha. So I don't know about changes in the atmosphere, but it is possible that when one includes the etheric in the atmosphere, that there are changes, and that there are, Steiner describes that there are possibilities which weren't there before, and that the being of Christ connected itself with the atmosphere of the earth, and even that it suffered a certain second death through the materialistic thinking, and that is all something which didn't happen on the physical earth. And so, yes.
I think the question maybe, Steiner mentions the aura, if you could see as a spiritual being, the aura of the earth change, you know that. And there's also this sort of ending of the Vedic path of breathing, that the air was in soul before
Yes.
that, and then it becomes just air.
And when you think of this aura, how to see an aura, and when you look at the how to get knowledge of the higher worlds, where Steiner described that, it's very interesting. He makes a footnote. Of course, it is not like we see with our eyes, yellow or blue or red, but we have an impression which creates an inner feeling which is comparable to the feeling we have when we look at blue or black, green or yellow. So it's again not something we see by that or by just dreaming, but we have to observe how we can have experiences in the etheric which create such a feeling. That's my approach. And I always have difficulties when that is connected with something spatial. There is a place where Steiner said the etheric body reaches about 80 centimeters over the physical body. And then I think, but how is the measurement with centimeters connected with the etheric? Then when I do that, I have a mental picture of the etheric which is very physical. So I would have asked him.
Could you speak a little bit more on the benefits, or what does it mean to have a fever for a human to have a fever? You're making that connection.
I made this connection at first only because I realized that is similar with a few degrees. And then I learned from my poor experience and friends who are doctors that they say when for example, there are medications to reduce the fever, and that they say that's a pity because it's an activity of the organism and it's an activity of the eye which makes the body warmer to overcome the infection. And of course, when the fever is very high or something, then it is useful to help that way. But at first, it is good to let the self-healing forces, which are apparent in this, do their work. And one can ask how that is connected with this process where we obviously do something to the earth which is comparable to a sort of infection of the human body. But that's all I can say to that. Maybe the doctors can say more.
On that same question, and it could be just in the States, but I've talked with several doctors who actually commented that the human being now is overriding their immune system. So when they get, she was giving the example of strep throat. They would have signs of strep throat, but not getting any of the symptoms of the immunity to fight it. And when they would take a culture of it, it was strep throat. And so they were very concerned that the body is not creating the immune system.
Mm-hmm.
So in relationship to the earth, how would that, could that give us some information?
Yes, I don't want to answer that in an associative way, but yes, just out of the pocket, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, then
Well,
I think we will enter supernature.